Hello, everyone. Welcome to DEI, a podcast dedicated to discussing and raising awareness on the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. My name is Kara Siet, and we're thrilled today to have Dynahlee Padilla Vasquez with us. She is a communication officer on the public affairs team at the United Nations Foundation. Prior to her work at UN, Dynahlee has served as the Senior Strategic Communication Associate for the National Immigration Forum in Washington, D.C. She is a journalist and advocate for equity and positive change. It's a pleasure to have you with us today, Dynahlee.
Thank you so much. I love the introduction. So appreciate it. You captured it perfectly.
Thank you. Do you mind to start off by introducing yourself and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Dynahlee Padilla Vasquez. As as you said, I work for the UN Foundation and I previously worked for the National Immigration Forum. And I'm generally very passionate about immigration reforms and, of course, prison reforms. And I am pro all the movement about not banning books. So I'm very much into, of course, like, as you mentioned, I am a former journalist and I still see myself as a journalist and a storyteller. So I'm all about not censoring people's access to information. And so everything you mentioned was on point. And yeah, I would also add that bottom line is I'm a writer. So anywhere where there's an opportunity to write and communicate, that's where I want to be.
Wow, got you. Yeah, because I'm in Florida, so like book banning is like a heated up conversation, and
Yeah.
obviously I've written a few articles about it in our school newspaper, but
Mhm.
it's an important issue to discuss, I guess, at the moment. And
Yes.
I know we've talked about this before briefly at our equity conference meeting,
Yes.
that you come of Latina descent.
Yes.
How has that identity influenced you in your work today?
Oh, absolutely. Like, I think my identity has shaped my work so much. For example, just knowing that I'm Puerto Rican and part Guyanese because of my grandfather, it really pushed me to want to learn Spanish formally. So I started in high school is when I started my Spanish language journey and I wanted to take all the Spanish classes. So from ninth grade all the way to 12th grade, I took Spanish and I wanted to continue it in college because at the time I wanted to be a bilingual journalist on broadcast. And so in college, I studied more Spanish. I ended up minoring in Spanish. And then I wanted to continue to immerse myself in the language. And I said, well, the only way to really do that and speak Spanish every day is if I study abroad in another country that's Spanish speaking only. And so by junior year of college, I studied abroad in Madrid, Spain for a semester. And so my Latinidad culture, being Puerto Rican, wanting that drive to speak and learn Spanish more formally, like learn to not only speak it, but write it, read it, comprehend it, have different conversations with different people that they may know Spanish, but like for me, like I only knew Puerto Rican Spanish, right? Like there's certain things that are different. There's a lot about Spanish language that's different in Spain. And so that shaped like how I wanted to view the world, right? I wanted to be bilingual. I wanted to continue studying in Spanish, wanting to learn other cultures, be able to communicate, like whether or not my Spanish is different than a Spaniard's Spanish, as long as we had the intent to communicate and connect, that's what I wanted. And so my identity has definitely shaped like what I wanted to study. And then in college, I ended up writing an article in journalism about people who are second, third generation Spanish speakers who they felt like they lost the language or never learned the language because of assimilation in the US. Be given the assimilation project in the US, there's just so many missed opportunities where like everyone's like, well, this is the culture. Like you have to learn to speak English and English only. And you lose because of that mindset and that culture in the US, which is unfortunate. A lot of kids lose language and they don't acquire language, they don't keep their home language, they don't maintain their culture, and it's not their fault, right? Like that's what the US did. I mean, they literally did that to Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico was annexed and it's technically a territory And even though Puerto Ricans are US citizens because of that, like a lot of Puerto Ricans don't know Spanish. And like that was me. And that's why I was like, well, I'm Puerto Rican. My last name at the time was Padilla, right? That's my maiden name. But my teachers are like talking to me in Spanish, and I'm like, ¿qué? Like they're like, what? And I'm like, I'm sorry, like I don't know Spanish. Like my parents didn't teach me. Why? Their parents didn't teach them. Why? They didn't really learn because it was all about you need to speak English. This is how you're gonna get up in the world. And that was just the time then, right? And so to tie it all back together, my identity really has shaped like what I wanted to learn, what I wanted to study, what types of things I wanted to write. And so in college, after Spain, I ended up for my senior year project, I interviewed people who, like me, thought they lost the language. And the title of the piece is called Reclaiming Spanish. Different generations of families and students, young people like me, who are like, wait a second, like, I want to learn my home language again. What happened? Why didn't this happen? And what can I do now, today, to try to reclaim my home language? And that was an amazing story, like, really fun to interview people about it. I learned more about my own personal family history. And thankfully, with the help of my professor, it ended up getting published at a outlet called the Hudson Valley River Newsroom. And so I'm grateful for that, because if it wasn't for my journey and my own experience, like wanting to speak Spanish and learn Spanish in that way, I would have never done that feature piece. And that all related to my career as well.
That's so cool. How does it, can you expand more on like how it relates to your career and also how your identity kind of shaped what you think of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah, absolutely. So because of that language journey of like just trying to like figure out how I want to continue to integrate Spanish into my life and my work, it really led me down to going to Madrid and like learning and living in a new country. And then that sparked the idea to interview other students as a journalism student, like interview other students like, hey, like, are you are you trying to reclaim your language? Like, why are you here in Spain? I went back to New Paltz, New York, where my college was. Like, there has to be other students like me, like wanting so badly to like relearn something, or something that their families have, right? Their parents may speak Spanish, their grandparents may speak Spanish or another language, a second language, but they don't. Why is that? And so those questions, that curiosity, those are all aspects of journalism, like thinking deeply about a story or an idea, following your gut and like asking the right questions to find that story, and then expanding on it by interviewing. And so if it wasn't for my curiosity and trying to think about, okay, what am I passionate about, which at that time was like, okay, my identity, Spanish language, relearning it. If it wasn't for those ideas, I wouldn't have really pursued the story, and then the story ended up getting published. So all those things combined really showed like, wow, like I really had an idea, like my personal experience of just wanting to learn Spanish all the way through, while other students, people might be going through this, let me write a story about this. Let this be my feature piece. And that's what helped me graduate. Like that was my capstone piece, which is like your end of the year, your end of the year like project before you graduate. And so that's how that relates. And as for your other question about DEI, like my identity, I'm always thinking about my identity because I'm Puerto Rican, I'm part Guyanese, I'm first generation college student. So I was the first in my family to graduate. And so all of that is important to me because it's all about what I said earlier about having access to information. So as a first gen, when I went to New Paltz, the reason why I chose it is because of that. Because there were opportunities for first gen like students like me. There was a big Latino and Black population. I'm originally from the Bronx, New York. I'm used to that. And I wanted an aspect of that in my new home, which ended up being New Paltz, New York, where SUNY New Paltz is. And so I always thought about that. Like, am I going to be comfortable here? What's the population like? Are there other people who speak Spanish? Are they Puerto Rican? Are they Dominican? Like, that's what I grew up around. And so I wanted an aspect of home in my new home. And I think that's how my identity helps shape my next steps. Like, where am I going to go to college? What do I want to study? Do these places and environments take into consideration like being equitable and being equal? Are there other people like me? And I think New Paltz, especially at the time when I was looking, I was just 18 years old, like trying to find a home away from home. Does it have all the things that are going to make me feel comfortable here and also feel included? And it really did. I enjoyed all my 4 years at New Paltz.
Yeah, that's so cool. And I feel like it's like my channel is called Don't Erase My Identity, and I can relate very well because I also come from like Chinese descent, and like I kind of immigrated here later on, and it's just building a community where everybody's diverse and included. Um Now
Exactly.
let's shift more towards like your work at UN. So before you worked at UN, you worked at the National Immigration Forum, right? Can you tell us more about how you ventured into that job?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the National Immigration Forum, at the time I was looking for work. So I was like looking, I was freelancing prior to that. So that's like the gig economy where you have an assignment, you get paid, but then it's like, okay, now what? Like I'm not full time. So I was looking for full time work. And what I loved about the National Immigration Forum was that in the job description, it was like, you're going to be reading immigration news, writing a newsletter about immigration, and also the stories and what we stand for are all about immigration reform. So bringing two sides together, Republicans, Democrats, and I should say not both sides, but conservatives, like all groups together to agree on immigration. Like what's going to be good for immigration? Where can we all what can we all agree on, all sides of political parties? Where can we all agree to push immigration reform forward so that immigrants have a full opportunities to thrive and like become citizens? And I love that mission. And I said, well, I love reading, I love writing. My grandfather on my mom's side is Guyanese. Like, this is perfect. Like, this is a way for me to use my writing and critical thinking and reading skills from my journalism background to put it to the table with something I'm passionate about, like immigration, especially with my family history. And so that's how I ended up finding that job on Idealist back in 2021 now. And I stood there for a little over 2 years. And um, what I also loved about it is just the fact that everyone there was like is very talented, like really cares about immigration. Like it's really hard to be in immigration work if you don't care. If you don't care about politics, if you don't care about, most importantly, the people involved and impacted, and if you don't care to read the news, right? You need to be abreast and knowledgeable about all the different changes that happen in the immigration system in one day. Imagine a week, imagine a month, imagine a year. Like what's happening in Congress and what's happening even at the border, right? And all the immigrant communities in between, like all across the US. And so that's how I ended up there, like just learning about it, being passionate about it, and saying, I'm going to apply. And at the time, thank God I got it. And it gave me such a deep appreciation for like what the US system goes through in terms of immigration, a deeper appreciation for immigrants doing their best to try to become citizens, even when the system knocks them down because of all the bureaucracies and red tape that like really limit them to try to get access into the country in the way where they can come in legally and not undocumented. And that's the whole point, right? Like they want to be here, but there's so much red tape that blocks them from trying to get here, for so many different reasons. That is why immigration reform is so important. And what I really appreciated about the forum, the National Immigration Forum, is that it's always about like consensus. What can we agree on so that immigrants can thrive? Where can we all come together at the table so that immigrants can thrive? And it's always about centering human dignity and remembering that immigrants are humans, they're people, and they're leaving their home countries for a reason. They're not just coming here because they want to. Like if they could stay at home, be safe and thrive there, they would. But if you're not thriving somewhere, if you're not safe somewhere, you're going to do everything you can to leave and find somewhere where there's safety and stability and a future. And so I always think about that. in terms of my work at the Immigration Forum. I was a writer for them. So I did press releases. I really, really led and wrote the newsletter with them and for them as a communications team. And I did a lot of media relations. So, like working with reporters. If reporters, for example, wanted to interview one of the National Immigration Forum experts, I'd connect them like, hey, if you're writing a story about this my colleague so and so, that's their portfolio, I'd be happy to connect you. And then God willing, we'd get a story out of it, right? And like building connections, building rapport. So that's what I did there. And as for my work at the UN Foundation, which is separate from the UN, but we work very closely with the UN, is I'm also a writer for them. So a lot of storytelling, advocacy work. Right now, I do a lot of media relations as well. So anytime an expert is needed from the UN Foundation, I'm connecting journalists with them. In terms of writing, I'm writing stories. So based on our plans for the calendar, like for example, around Mother's Day last year, there was a report that UNICEF came out with that talked about the 12 hardest hit countries where women and girls were malnourished. So, lack of food, lack of water, things to make them healthy, right? And so, for that story, I interviewed a couple of nutritionists from the World Food Program, which is a UN agency, and I spoke to them over Zoom in different time zone, which was awesome, and just hear like what are the solutions for this? What are they doing on the ground to help these women and children in these hard hit countries? And what are things that like the audience can do, everyday people can do to help them get out of malnourishment, get out of what some countries face is like famine, right? And how can they help? And in the storytelling process, it's a little bit more of advocacy, like because we want a call to action, right? I'm telling you about this report. I'm telling you who's being hardest hit. I'm giving you the stats, the facts, the quotes. Now, are you willing to help? Are you willing to join this cause? What else can we do to spread the word? And so that's what's different about my work at the UN Foundation is that even though with the forum there was a lot of advocacy work, a lot of the time the digital team did that and I was on the communications team, while here I'm on a communications team that does a lot more of the advocacy work, like asking for a call to action. What can we do next? What is the next step? So yeah, I do a lot of writing, feature stories, a lot of skills that are similar in terms of media relations and writing press statements when needed. But what I do appreciate about the UN Foundation is that there's more storytelling opportunities. Like because I work for a global organization based in the US, I was able to interview people from South Sudan, for example. Whereas in the National Immigration Forum, they're very focused on US immigration, of course. Like that's their thing. So we are in some ways limited, right, to the experts we can talk to because we're talking about US immigration. And of course, bipartisanship, different parties coming together. And that's not always the case, right? But because their mission is like that's so unique, there are opportunities there, of course. But with the UN Foundation, I'm doing writing work for global health, for climate, for anything that the UN is focused on.
Right. That's so cool. What are some of the challenges that you faced working at those foundation, and how do you think like those foundations like UN Foundation or the Immigration Forum has helped shape DEI in a way?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think for both of them, they're both great companies, right? Like I was at the National Immigration Forum and I'm now at the UN Foundation. And I think something that generally like early in my career, I'm almost 5 years after graduating college. So in the 5 years, I've noticed like you really need great leadership and sponsors and mentors to help you see the path you can have to go somewhere. And so I've been very fortunate and blessed to like have leaders and mentors that are like, Dynahlee, like you're such a good writer. Like, let's keep sharpening this. Let's think about ways you can even get better at this. Let's think about your next step in your career, right? But even with the best mentors and sponsors to help you see that, sometimes bureaucracy hits and it's like, you're great. We love you. but right now we don't have the budget to promote you, for example, or we don't have the budget to send you on this trip so that you can work on these stories, right? And so I would say that that's always a hurdle, money. It's like, is it time? Are you ready for a promotion? Yes. Do we have the money for it? No. Or are you ready for this trip? Yes. But do we have the funds for it? No. Do we have the grant for it? No. And so I think it's more about like, for me, like having patience, knowing that like your time is coming and that people see you and your value, but it's just sometimes money is not on your side, and that's not something you can control. But I also think there are other times where like it's good to like put on your DEI lens and think about, okay, am I like what's happening here? Is it that I have the value or not? Is it the budget or not? Is it another thing, right? Is it because I'm a woman, or is it because I'm Puerto Rican, or what is it, right? And so like thinking critically about, okay, are these things happening because of my identity, or is this happening because of bureaucracy, or a little bit of both? And so really distinguishing that, and just also just reflecting, right? Like, is this the place I want to continue growing with? Or do I see this as a stepping stone? Or do I want to branch out because I want to try something new? And like all those questions are valid, but like constantly having those reflections about like your identity, your passion, staying true to who you are, staying true to what you want to do in life. We work so much, especially Americans, like that's what we're told to like do, like study, get a good job, keep going until it's time to retire. And you got to do what you love and love what you do, and it's a journey of finding it. It's not always going to be like the perfect match, right? Like the forum was amazing, but I didn't stay there for the whole time. Why? I'm also like, I want to grow too, right? I want to look for new opportunities. I want to try something new. It's always good to like try new adventures and see what else you're interested in. I thought I was going to be a broadcast journalist on TV. I did not do that. I did that all throughout college, but look at the ebbs and flows of my career so far since I graduated almost 5 years ago this May. So you just never know. But those constant reflections and thinking about ways in which like jobs can do DEI better. I look around like, are there other women of color here in the room with me? Are there other Puerto Ricans, other Latinos? Just things like that. Are you first gen? And just having those conversations, because that builds community as well. So I'm always looking for that, whether it's in this job or a future job. And I think where I've landed, I've always found that. And I'm always looking for more of that.
Right. So how has your foundation right now, like UN Foundation, um, how has DEI played a role in its decision making and within its like structure in the
Yeah.
organization?
That's a great question. So I would say, even though I'm not on the DEI like inclusion committee, we do have something like that at the UN Foundation, and I think that is a great first step. Like bringing everybody who wants to like be a part of that and listen into ideas. One of the meetings that I went to with them was all about like, okay, we're having this meeting. Whoever wants to join this inclusion committee can. And we talked about different ways to volunteer and get involved, different things that the committee can do. Like, for example, I think I spoke to you about for the Dia de los Muertos, which is Day of the Dead. That committee led an initiative to have everyone send in photos and little stories of who they wanted to remember and commemorate. And someone on that team was able to print them all out and create an altar on the 12th floor of our office building. And like, that was so beautiful. Like, one, that was like time and attention. That was effort to like this holiday and to people in this culture that celebrate Dia de los Muertos, especially Latin Americans and people in Central America and Mexicans, right? Like, so I loved that initiative because it was so beautiful just to see it, even though I didn't personally participate or send a photo or a story, just going up there to see that it was done and reading them like on my lunch break, and just seeing how beautiful the altar was. That was, I was like, wow, like that's so nice. Like they started an initiative, they followed through, someone like took their time to like send stories and stuff, and it allowed people to be engaged without it like being so much on one person, right? Like you can submit stories and someone else will take care of the rest for you. And when you want, when you're ready, it's here on the 12th floor for you to view and see and pray to, right? If you want. And I think that was really beautiful. So I love that the UN Foundation has this inclusion committee. I don't know it's the exact name now, it's evading me, but it is a sort of inclusion committee. And they did an initiative like that back in late October, early November.
That's so sweet. And you also mentioned that a big part of your identity is being a journalist. So, how has that part of yourself helped you advocate for different voices to be heard?
Yeah, great question. I think because a journalist naturally like has so many questions and so many ideas that they're like constantly thinking of the next story or the next question or what is nagging at them, right? Like what keeps you up at night that you want to investigate or like dig deeper further into. So I think that has shaped my ability, like like having those questions, constant like natural questions, has helped me think about, okay, for this story that we're writing, like for the UNICEF one with the malnourished women and children, I'm thinking about, okay, we're about to launch this around Mother's Day. What do mothers like want to hear about this? Like, how can other mothers help these people, even though you might be a mother in the US and not in one of these hard hit countries like Afghanistan or Yemen, for example, in this report? Like, what would mothers want to tell other mothers? What would communities want to tell these folks, and what are like simple solutions that everyday people can do to help this situation, even though it may seem so far away and so remote. At the end of the day, we're all human. We all need the basics to like live life, right? Like food, water, shelter. And especially in these hardest hit countries, they don't even have that, like at minimum. So just thinking about it in a humanistic like perspective and using my journalism skills in terms of like how to formulate a question, how to think more deeply beyond like, so what's the story and why is this happening? No, thinking about the human aspect of it, because that also comes from my National Immigration Forum background, like thinking about the immigrant as a human, right? And not just someone trying to come into the US, because that's the wrong narrative, right? Like think about the context. Why are they coming? Why do they want to leave? What's going on? What is a root problem of them needing and wanting to come into the US to find a better life, or whatever their reason is? And so thinking about all of that in terms of root causes, why is someone doing what they're doing beyond the surface, and helping that helps shape stories so much, I think.
Right. And a final question unrelated to most of like our conversation right now.
Yeah.
So DEI is under attack and kind of considered controversial at the moment, and I'm sure you've read some news articles about it, some fights on it. What are your thoughts on how DEI is evolving, and do you think that the current attacks are just part of DEI's evolution?
Hmm. It's a great question too. I think there's a lot that I continue to need to read about DEI, especially like how it relates to organizations, like overall, like not just in the US, but like even elsewhere where they're trying to be more equitable and accessible. But I think for DEI, it just, in for my personal opinion, the more we can bring diverse voices into the table, onto our newsrooms, into leadership, into like even interns, right? Like we're all part of this structure at an organization, in schools, and the more we can bring people on board that are not the same, the better. Because if we're not the same, we're able to contribute differently, ask different questions, think about things in a different light or context, ask each other questions. Like, for example, like I may not know a lot about your culture, you may not know a lot about mine, and yet we're here having a conversation, learning more about each other. And like that in itself is like that's a value add. There's a dialogue here that we're having, that if it wasn't for going to the Atlantic meeting, we would have never even met, right? And so you came all the way from Florida. I came from Virginia, but we met in DC. And that in itself shows that like there are opportunities for like conversation and both of us getting in the room, right? We're women of color at this prestigious Atlantic like free convention, and we were able to access that. And
Right.
that's knowledge that we wouldn't have gotten had we not like put ourselves out there or found the opportunity or been invited, right? And so I think in my opinion, like that's really the only way like DEI can continue expanding, is like letting people like us like have more opportunities for that. And if it's free, even better, right? Because what if it was a paid thing that we had to do? Like maybe we wouldn't have been able to for one reason or another, because it would require more effort on us to be like, well, can I afford this? Can I go here? How can I get here? And so just making sure that like people in the room, there's more different voices for us and more opportunities for dialogue and more free opportunities for access, because that way we all have equal opportunities to be able to make a decision. Do we want to do this? Do we want to have this dialogue? At least we can make the decision to be a part of it, as opposed to like being completely rejected from it at all.
Love your response. I
Yeah.
completely agree because I feel like a lot of times we think of diversity in many other ways. Yeah.
Right.
Um, Thank you so much for being here today. It was
Right.
an
Welcome.
incredible discussion, and I really hope to have you back again.
Oh, thanks so much. I really appreciated all your questions. It was a pleasure.